Welcome back. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, and discuss some of Africa's key economic issues. Dr. Adesina, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you for the first time on an edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Well, thank you very much, Shaka. I've heard great things about you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Now, let me ask you, I gather that this is the first time that you have actually attended the spring conference of the World Bank and IMF as a voice, as an economic voice of Africa. Tell us, what was the experience like?
Well, you know, it's great for me to be here. It's my first spring meeting, as you rightly said, as president of the African Development Bank. It's been fantastic. We discussed a range of issues. I think not least of them was the economic headwinds that African countries face and what those implications mean for Africa. And my position is that you take a look at Africa today, African economies are growing at, average of 4.4% in terms of GDP growth rates. And the global economy is growing at 3.3%. It's been re-evaluated down to 3.2% by IMF. Europe is growing at 1.9%. So Africa is actually doing reasonably quite well. I think the message for me is that Africa is not unraveling by any chance. I think African economies have shown tremendous amount of resilience. So in tough times, Africa is still doing very well. And even the 4.4% that we all talk about, we forget that East Africa, for example, is growing at 6.5%. So Africa continues to be the place to invest. I think we discussed quite a lot about that. I feel that the message is clear that Africa is still the place to invest in.
What about the falling prices in terms of commodities, and we're talking about oil and gas?
Well, obviously, for the last 10 years, Africa has witnessed tremendous amount of growth on the back of commodity super cycle that we have had, and largely because of the growth in China. 85%, however, of the exports of Africa to China happens to be, primary commodities, whether it's minerals, metals, agricultural products. And these tend to have cyclical behavior, and you have all these volatilities. Yes, they have been affected. Some countries more hard hit than others. You look at those that export oil, for example, big ones like Nigeria or Angola have been very badly hit. Zambia, copper has been badly hit, and South Africa, and also Algeria and other countries. But that's not everything. I think you have those that are net importers of oil that also benefit. So you have an equilibration that actually goes on. Well, for me, the thing that comes out of this is first and foremost another lesson that we must learn again, which is that African economies absolutely have to diversify. But I also think it's another reminder of the importance for Africa to grow its own regional market, because the countries that actually export into wider regional markets are always less susceptible to global commodity price volatilities. I think that's another thing that we must do. As you know, in Africa today, only 11% of trade, intra-regional trade, happens between us. And I think we should have an Africa without borders. I think we should have an Africa where we can trade among ourselves. And this is critical to the work that we do at the African Development Bank. So in any way, all I'm saying is that the projections do show that Africa will recover to about 5.2, 5.3%, 2017, 2018. So Africa will continue to be on an upswing, but I think we have to address structural issues, which is really get into agriculture that allows us to have inclusive growth, and also deepen our work in investment in electricity, because without power you have nothing.
Think about agriculture. I gather that you are a son of a farmer.
Yeah.
You are, in fact, a legitimate farmer yourself. You studied agricultural economics.
Yes.
There was a time when your great country, Nigeria, was food self-sufficient. In fact, not only did it feed itself, it could even afford to export to other parts of the world. What happened?
It's not acceptable that a continent that has 65% of all the arable land left in the world to feed 9 billion people by 2050 is not able to feed itself. It just doesn't make any sense. We have a lot of water, a lot of land, a lot of great sunshine, and great hardworking people. You throw up any seed before it hits the ground, literally it can grow anywhere in Africa. So I believe African countries should actually focus on agriculture, and Africa should be a global powerhouse in food and agriculture. But what tends to happen is that, the classic Dutch disease, and people find oil, oil is, you don't do anything, you just scoop it, and so it's easier to do. And as that happens, exchange rate appreciates, and therefore it becomes uncompetitive for agricultural sector now to grow. Now, I think when I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, before I became President of the African Development Bank, I took a position that we had to move away from just depending on oil to actually looking at the riches under our soil, the soil wealth itself, and that is in agriculture. But we have to start taking agriculture as a business, not as a way of life. And that's what we did. As president of the African Development Bank, I took the position that we're going to have some priorities, and we set 5 priorities for ourselves at the bank. And at the top of that priority is energy, to light up and power Africa. Second one is to feed Africa, hence the point on agriculture. And on that one, what we really want to do is to allow African countries to unlock the potential of their agricultural sector.
Let's talk about energy. You obviously have more than 600 million Africans who have no access to electricity. How are you going to come up with the miracle of making sure that these people have unfettered access to that aspect of energy?
When you take a look at the problem, it's actually quite sad, and for me as an African, extremely embarrassing, that 138 years after Thomas Edison developed the light bulb, we can't light it. Makes no sense. Today you have 645 million Africans that don't have access to electricity. The kids can't go to school and learn. 90% of the schools in Africa, primary schools, over 95%, don't have electricity. And you look at the number of secondary schools that don't have electricity, right? Kids can't learn in the dark. Today, Africa loses roughly 5% of the GDP annually because of lack of electricity, because small and medium-sized businesses can't function. Vaccines in hospitals can't work. No, so we've got to also recognize that, period. Africa is simply tired of being in the dark, right? The lack of electricity in Africa is the greatest drag on our development. When you take a look at the amount of resources that we have, it's tremendous. And we have so much sunshine that, literally it's almost limitless. We can have 11 terawatts of energy out of solar. If you take a look at a hydro, right, huge amount of hydro potential, about 350 gigawatts of potential for hydro. And you look at the whole issue of wind, you're talking about another 150 gigawatts potential for wind. And in East Africa area, you have a lot of geothermal potential, probably another 15 gigawatts of potential. Not to talk of the fact that we have natural gas being flared into the air, like in Nigeria and other places, and you also have access to coal, which is all across South Africa, Botswana, every other place. So literally, Shaka, Africa has no business.
And South Africa, of course, has access to nuclear.
For being in the dark. So what we've done is, I've said our priority in Africa is to help to light up and power Africa, and to do that within 10 years. And to do that, we require that we have a new conversation about energy. That's why the bank launched, the African Development Bank launched what we call the New Deal on Energy for Africa. Under that New Deal for Energy for Africa, we're hoping to connect 160 million people.
How are you going to fund it?
Well, if you take a look at the amount of resources we have in terms of taxes, right? Africa today generates about $500 billion in taxes every year. We're doing quite well in terms of taxes now. If you just take 10% of that and you dedicate it to the energy sector, problem is almost going to be solved. Then you take a look also at what's going to happen with regard to the amount of money we have sitting out there in our pension funds. Today, Africa has about $334 billion in its pension funds. You look at sovereign wealth funds, $164 billion. Private equity funds, $20 billion. We've just got to get clever at leveraging this huge amount of resources into the energy sector. as the African Development Bank, the ways in which we're going to do that is we're going to invest $12 billion over the next 5 years in the energy sector. And part of that will be used to leverage $45 to $50 billion from the private sector.